All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic Sebastian Smee. Sebastian, how are you doing?
Great. I'm well. How about you?
I'm good. I'm good. You got yourself a new book, a
Yes, I
big,
do.
ambitious, juicy book, Paris in Ruin. So we'll get to this in a moment. Fascinating story. I, the ignoramus that I am, never knew that Paris was and bombarded and well, I didn't know the story of that time that they were under siege, but we're going to get to that in a moment. Let's start with you, my friend. You're an art critic, as I said, won the Pulitzer. I'm always interested. I have a friend who was a critic for the New York Times, grew up with him. And I just remember that he's Tony Scott, A.O. Scott, and we were going to see a movie. And he was like, we were all 14 and we had just got to see Apocalypse Now. And we were like, yeah, that was pretty fun. And then he launched into this very cogent description. I was like, that was unusual, Tony. And he goes on. So my question to you is, were you always a critic, or did you feel that? I mean, I use that term not in terms of its criticism or criticizing, but someone interested in looking at work that way, or did that evolve over time?
Yeah, well, look, I guess it does evolve, right? And I guess, you certainly don't expect, that's a hilarious anecdote. I don't think I was expecting to be an art critic
No.
from the age of 14. But I know around that age I was really engaged with stuff and really excited, not just art, but film, books, all of that.
Right.
And I was reading a lot of stuff about those mediums, criticism by other people, essays. I grew up in Australia. You can probably hear
Yeah,
from my
I
accent, I'm
can. I
Australian. And,
gotcha.
there were some really, influential and fun to read critics around. People like Robert Hughes, who ended up living in New York and working for Time magazine as an art critic for a long time. Germaine Greer, the feminist critic
Yeah.
who, or,
Yeah.
feminist theorist who also wrote a lot of criticism. Clive James as well. Both of those
Yeah.
lived in the UK mostly. And there were critics living in Australia too. So I think that, I just got excited by it all. And because I
But
found I was really powerfully affected by films and by art,
yeah.
I wanted to engage and
What
talk about it with
excited you
friends.
about the critics' work? What was it particularly that so turned you on about that?
When you read something that helps you connect with something you've just seen and make sense of it, a lot of great art, especially when it's fresh to you, is bamboozling. It's like, did I
Yeah.
like that? Do I hate it? What's
Yeah.
going on? And then
Yeah.
you read something about it, and if it's well written, if it's not pretentious, if it connects, if it's got a sense of life behind it, and enthusiasm, then you want a bit of that. And I think that's how I felt. And I wanted to try to emulate that in my
Right.
own way.
Now that's interesting because I have to say, Paris in Ruins, beautifully written and really like engaged. And I got to say, I was reading it and I was like, oh my God, this poor bastard. He he had to. I know you loved it, but the amount
Oh,
of detail you had to make this thing come to life. And it happened a long time ago before there was Facebook, like way before there were iPhones. Like you had to dig up such detail. And my hat goes off to you, my friend, because you
I
really made it come to
appreciate that.
life.
Look, it's probably too detailed in places. My editor
Right.
was saying, cut it back, and I kept doing that. But yeah, I was overwhelmed by the story. Just creating a kind of timeline of these events, you realized how involved and almost kind of cinematic it was on a
Yeah.
day-to-day level. So yeah, I tried to capture some of that. But thank you for saying it. It was painful, to be honest. It took
Was it?
5 or 6 years, and I just found it harder than anything I've tried to write before.
Well, you know what? It's because you maybe were doing something different and you took yourself somewhere new. I always think that I don't think writing has to be hard, but I think sometimes when we ask something new of ourselves, it can get challenging and it's a good feeling because we're going
Yeah,
somewhere
you're using
different.
muscles you don't necessarily
That's
have.
right.
I'm used to writing sort of 1,500 word articles for the Washington Post, but
Right.
this is a much longer narrative, and yeah, you have to you have to work up the muscles for it. That's for sure.
So I tell the story of Tony of A.O. Scott, my friend, and I knew he wanted to be a creative writer. And then I just remember not to keep talking about him, but I always thought it was interesting his evolution because we were both young guys interested in music and creative writing. And he'd gone to Harvard young. He was very precocious. And he was like, and I was like, oh, Tony, how's Harvard? What's it like? And he started saying, well, I'm really kind of interested in academics. I'm getting interested in like I'm like, why? Why? No, no, no. Just keep writing fiction. What are you doing? And he right away was taking. So you go off to university, I assume. When do you start feeling yourself saying, okay, I'm going to be a critic and a writer? Like you see, like that's actually not just something I'm interested in, but this may be my life's work. Do you remember that, how that came about, or was it accidental? Because I think he kind of fell into it. He was just doing book reviews for like money or something. And it, next thing I knew,
Yeah.
you know,
I went to university in the 90s, and I got to say that, not just art history departments, but a lot of other humanities departments were kind of overwhelmed at that point by French theory. All these
oh
French
God, yes,
philosophers whose stuff was
yes,
impenetrable, and
yes,
often probably badly translated. And,
yeah,
I mean, I'm grateful that I read some of that, and obviously there are a lot of insights to be had, but I'm also conscious that I was kind of in reaction against that, and I wanted to read and think about writers who were talking on a high level, but in an accessible way, in great
yeah,
prose,
yeah.
and so yeah, there was a kind of reaction, and then did I realize that I don't know. I mean, it did happen a bit by accident. I remember I was sort of just doing odd jobs around the place. I'd moved to the snowy mountains in Australia, where I
Okay.
was working in a ski resort, thinking I do want to
As
write. I
all
do want
great
to
art
write this.
critics do.
Yeah. And then I realized I was down to my last, $200, and I thought I've got to get something going here. And so I put together a bit of a portfolio. I'd only had one or two things published in sort of fashion magazines,
Right.
and I sent those and a bunch of unpublished things to all the editors I could think of, none of whom got back to me. But I also sent the portfolio to a couple of writers, and one of
Wow.
those was an art critic at the Sydney Morning Herald, the main newspaper in Sydney,
Okay.
Australia. And he was kind enough to get back to me. I'll always be grateful to him. His name's John McDonald. And he helped me get a position at the Sydney Morning Herald at the age of 23. So I've been doing this
Wow.
since
Wow.
that age.
Wow.
And I just feel so lucky that I was given that chance and then allowed to learn on the job, because it was pretty clear to everyone that I really didn't know what I was doing,
Right.
But if you can learn on the job, it's the best way, right?
So you're a journalist and that you're on assignment. They say there's something happening there, go there. You go, they're sending you out on assignment essentially, yeah, to different art shows or
It was a weekly column that I did, and I
what?
would I,
You
I would
got
write about, yeah, no, not a serious big column. It was just in the sort of Friday What's On guide, and
right.
I would write about three commercial gallery exhibitions in each column,
Okay.
and it was super fun. I mean, I learned so much as I went around the galleries, all these artists in Australia that no one's heard of outside of Australia, but actually it's a really vibrant art scene there,
Sure.
and you come across all sorts of things, and you keep having to get your head around new stuff. At that
Yeah.
age, there was just a lot of stuff I hadn't seen, I wasn't familiar with. But people were saying, "Oh, this is great, that's great," and so and then you have to say, well, if you've heard that, but you still don't think it's great, you think it's actually pretty bad, you have to learn to say that as well and find the right way to say that, and
Yeah,
that's
it's
that's
tough,
one of the
man,
hard
because
things about criticism.
I have to say, because the artist worked pretty hard on it. I can guarantee you that. I can guarantee it was, did you read Priscilla Gilman's memoir, The Critic's Daughter? It's
Didn't
interesting
know.
because her father was, now I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, Priscilla Gilman, she's a professor at Yale, but father was a
Right.
big critic in the big theater critic, the theater critic sort of in the 80s. Um,
Okay, right.
I'm blanking on his name, but
I
whatever.
should know too, but don't worry.
Well, whatever. But it was a tricky relationship he had with the artist because he loved him, and but it was his opinion.
Yeah, it is tricky, and
Right? I think you must
it,
go through that, right?
of course, and you have an understand. You hope that your readers have an understanding that you're offering a subjective opinion. It's part of a conversation, a deeper and wider conversation. But there's no question that you have power in that conversation. You can't
Oh
deny that.
boy. Oh
It would
boy.
be it would be evasive to not admit that, I think. And so, I think you have to tread carefully. I think because I was quite excited as a young writer by reading vigorous, trenchant art criticism and other criticism by people, there were times I got carried away, I would say, sort of being negative about, especially about people who have a big reputation, and you felt that
Right. You got to
they deserve to be brought down to
yeah,
size a
take him
bit.
down a peg.
Yeah, yeah, you sort of figure they can handle it. Um, but yeah, there are
Don't
instincts there.
presume that. Do
Yes,
not presume
exactly
that.
right. there are dark instincts there that you have to, be careful about. And I think I've mellowed in that sense. I worked in the UK as well for 4 years,
Right.
and I think there's a different culture of criticism in both those places, Australia
Hmm.
and the UK, compared to here in the States, where although there are sort of critics who'll come out pretty strongly in a negative way, it's more frowned upon. I think there's more tolerance for
Oh,
that in other
wow.
cultures, and I think that here it tends to reflect badly on you if you get carried away being negative
Oh.
about even someone with a big reputation.
Oh, that's interesting. I've always felt that one of the challenges when being a critic is I think it's easier to say you don't like something than you do, because I feel like you make yourself vulnerable when you champion something, because it just strikes me that that not liking something, you're kind of invulnerable in a weird way, but if you like something, you're putting yourself right there with the artist for someone else to criticize and say, "Are you crazy?"
Yeah,
I don't know if that's true. That's always been my impression, that there's a sort of challenge in that.
I know what you mean. I really do. I have to say though that I feel like if I have a strength most of the time I feel, completely not up to it. I feel like an imposter and a fraud. But
Oh,
I do
another
feel
one.
no, I'm serious. I'm serious. I'm not
Okay.
just saying that. But I do feel like, you know, a way to connect with readers and a way to feel like what I'm doing has some deeper purpose is actually to be open-hearted, to sort of to
Oh,
go in with feeling and to say, all right, this is an amazing privilege to be doing this job. I'm not going to love everything, but if I am enthusiastic about something, that's my job to convey that, to be excited, to be open-hearted. A lot of great art is about feeling, it's not about checking boxes and this is good and that's bad and what it's about passion and feeling, and the artists who are good are going in with that passion and feeling. And I feel like I want to try to meet them there and convey to readers that same kind of open-heartedness. So I try not to be all defensive and sort of, Mandarin-like about that.
I like it. That's right. Criticize from the heart, or talk about from the heart. Because yes, it
Appreciate
is
from the heart.
totally
Yeah,
about
yeah,
emotion. It's all I always tell my students: feel first, write second. No one cares
yeah.
about your story really, but they care about how they feel when they read the story. That's really the currency of human beings. That's what art has taught me. We only care about how we feel. We always want to feel good. We never want to feel bad. And this is throughout all of history. Okay, speaking of
Right.
history, let's get to this book. So from 1870 to 1871, Paris is besieged by what would become the German Empire, but it wasn't yet, right? And this was Napoleon III was there was I so don't know the history of France. I didn't even realize there were more Napoleons than the original one, but it makes sense. Okay. But you did something interesting, because this is an art history book, and it's and so and you got into the history of the Impressionism, sort of the beginning of Impressionism, really, right? I mean, this is kind of where it starts, and it overlapped with politics, with republicanism, with authoritarianism, and I have to say, I don't. Obviously, it took you a long time to write this, but it was strangely timely. It was strangely timely, wasn't it?
In a way, I guess, I certainly felt that during the writing of it in some ways, where you had, the pandemic, which felt like a sort of equivalent to the siege of Paris that you mentioned. And
Yep.
then I don't know that what happens after that, and we can get to that, but it's this sort of insurrection, this left-wing
Yep.
insurrection called the Commune. And that I think had some parallels, you don't want to push it too far, but with what
Right.
was going on in our politics here. But yeah, look, the story is really just focused on two painters that I happen to absolutely love. Edouard Manet, often thought of as the father of Impressionism, and Berthe Morisot, a wonderful painter who was really the only woman to be connected to the Impressionist group from the very beginning. And they both lived through the siege of Paris, when Napoleon III, as you say, was defeated by the Prussian army, which became Germany during this period. And, they went through hell. They really did. It
Right.
was such an ordeal. And my sense is always just that histories of Impressionism and Impressionist exhibitions tend to kind of skip over that. They mention, what Victor Hugo called the terrible year, the siege
Right.
and the Commune, but they sort of skip quickly along. But my sense was that they had been through such an ordeal that it had to have an effect on the kind of art that they then went on to make.
Right.
And so, yeah, I just try to tell that story. Yeah.
What drew you to that? So talk to me about how I mean, you had written about the Impressionists in one of your previous books correct?
I'd written about actually that book was called The Art of Rivalry, and it was about the sort of frenemy type relationships
Ah,
between four sets of artists. And one
okay.
of those was Manet, who I mentioned, and
Yep.
Edgar Degas.
The guy.
And Morisot, the painter I mentioned as well, is played a big part in that chapter, but it was focused on the 1860s. So in a
Right.
sense, this book takes us into the next period, the end of that decade and this terrible year of upheaval.
And so often happens when you're working on one book, you get an idea for another. Was that partly how this one began? That as you were poking around and going in deep to those period that you said, what? What? Oh, I hadn't. That kind of how this started, or am I off?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't planned. Definitely wasn't planned. Certainly, even a year after I finished Art of Rivalry, I had no intention to write this book.
All right.
But over maybe the next, couple of years, it became clear that this was a really juicy subject and I should get into it. So, yeah, but it meant that I had to almost kind of pretend to be a bit of a military historian, which I'm definitely not, and a social historian. So it was a quick learning curve. And, I'm deeply indebted to all the great scholars and academics and writers who've written about this period before. But my main, job I felt in this was to sort of bring the two things together: the art history, the history of the beginnings of Impressionism, and the social and political history of this incredible year of tumult and upheaval.
I've always been interested in the sort of history of art, period, writing, theater, painting, and it's particularly that time from late Romanticism into the modernism. How everything was sort of doing like everyone was, no matter what medium you were in, everyone was sort of starting to do the same thing, to kind of going away from this very formal way of doing everything, and doing their own version of impressionism, their own version musically, narratively, and impressionism was such a huge revolution, really. It's hard for us to think of it now, but I feel like it has to be tied to some psychic way to how we as human beings were changing the way we governed ourselves, which is what you're getting into. But it always struck me so profound to say, no, it doesn't have to be completely realistic. That it seems so simple to us now, but it was like you breaking the rules. You're not doing it the way you're supposed to be doing it, right?
Totally, absolutely. I'm so glad you see it that way. I mean, they're such pretty pictures, and in a way, people are almost tired of Impressionism. It
Yeah.
seems so sort of complacent because you've got these landscapes and women
Right.
in pretty dresses and flowers and so on. But it was so radical, and there are so many ways to explain Impressionism. We talk about the invention of photography, the influence of Japanese prints, the movement known as realism,
Yeah.
which sort of then turns into Impressionism. But you're right, they really were breaking the rules. They themselves at first couldn't even accept that what they were doing was finished art. They were
Right.
they were they were they were treated as just sketches and unfinished, badly painted works of art. But there was this political element to it, and they were all small R Republicans, i.e., they were democratic and they were against the authoritarian regime of Napoleon III. They wanted democratic values and freedoms, to sort of be open to everyone, but especially to affect art, which was at that time mired in sort of government involvement and sort of
Mm,
moral rhetoric and
right.
old-fashioned values. And they were written about in Republican journals by Republican critics, and they were sort of tarred with the brush of the radical left-wing Republicans who, as I say, staged this coup in 1871 that became known as the Commune. And, when they staged their first breakaway Impressionist exhibition, a lot of the conservative writers associated them with this radical group of communards
Oh,
who had just
see,
sort of created so much destruction.
there's always been a link between, I have a lot of, so right now here in America, there's some politics going on, and there's a whole, there's always been an overlap between the artist and the and what's going on politically. And it's kind of a tricky relationship, quite frankly, because I've always felt that the artist needs to be looking at something eternal, whereas politics are always about what's happening right now in this moment. And it's not, it's again, I think it's very much about the moment. So it seems like a difficult relationship for a lot of artists to
Tricky,
manage.
isn't it? I mean, I mean, I know what you're saying about, the eternal values you associate with art, but it's interesting, Manet was great friends with Charles Baudelaire, and one of the things he wrote in this famous essay called The Painter of Modern Life was that beauty is made up of two parts: one, the eternal and the timeless, and the other, the contingent, the fleeting, the
Oh,
present tense, the
right.
fragmentary, you know,
Oh, okay.
and that was the side of things that I think the Impressionists embraced, or at least wanted to bring back into a kind of balance. So yeah, but you're right. You have to be really careful about how you link art with political and historical events. I think there's never a straight line, and in some ways, it's kind of like the movements of psychology, right? Like there are some events that affect us directly, and you can see the link. There are others that are kind of like there's repression, there's sublimation, there's projection, like
Yeah,
all these things that make it much more nuanced and subtle. And I think in some ways, the Impressionists weren't just directly expressing their politics, they had just gone through this big trauma
yeah,
and they were in part recoiling from the consequences of that trauma. They were sympathetic to the communards, but they were also saying, "Man, that got too intense. We don't
right,
want to
right,
necessarily be part of that, and
right.
we want to look forward, and we want our society, which we've just seen ripped apart, be put back together and
Yeah.
healed." And I don't know how conscious any of these things were, but I think you can feel all those things going on in the Impressionist movement.
Artists almost always to be, and I say artists, I mean all artists, tend to be a bit, because they have to kind of be outside the mainstream a little bit, because they have to be willing to do whatever they want to do. They have to be able to
Yeah.
say, and they can't, you really have to be that way. Talk to a bunch of Mars friends who've been raised in religious communities, like it's really tricky in a religious community because there's some rules. And like, what if you don't want to follow those? So it's very natural, but describing your commune, all I can think of is another great time in American history, I guess Western history, which is the 60s, when music and art in particular was so enmeshed with what was going on. And John Lennon writing Revolution, which was his
Oh
kind of
yeah.
reaction to what some there were doing. And how it was all caught up, how it was so like you almost couldn't disentangle what was happening politically from what was happening artistically at that time.
And it's so true, right? It gets so complicated, but when you see it from a distance, it's just so clearly the case, right? That you've got
Right.
stuff going on and it's all interconnected and tangled up. And all these artists knew each other. In the
Sure.
1860s, before the terrible year I'm talking about, they were all hanging out together in these cafes in a part of
Sure.
Paris called the Batignolles, and they were all really influenced by Manet, and they were watching what he was doing because he was a real maverick, as you say. I mean,
Right.
the great artists often are, and it's partly sometimes they're temperamentally not even inclined to that. He was from a fairly upper class background, but you know, we all have sort of deeper emotional feelings, and sometimes they have to kick against what our families and what our all the societal conventions around us are dictating, and
Yeah.
you can almost be a rebel, in spite of yourself or in spite of your best interests. And Manet really took a beating. He again and again he showed these radical looking works at the annual salon, the official
Yeah.
showcase for art, and he just got a critical drubbing. I mean, it's sobering, and he suffered from it,
Yeah.
and yet he kept going. So it's really interesting, isn't it, to think about the courage that that takes.
Oh, it takes, I think, not to keep coming back to the 60s, but I just think about that time Bob Dylan went through when he plugged in and he was getting booed every single night. I mean, getting
Yeah,
booed.
Judas. Right.
Yes, again and again. And
Yeah.
he tells a story of Robbie Robertson tells a story of them playing for the first time and they just booed, booed, booed. And the Robbie Robertson, the band, they're going through trauma. And Dylan comes off and says, "Wasn't that great? Let's do it again." So he was off.
I mean, what an incredible moment that was, right? And
Oh,
there's a sense in which he was, when someone in the crowd called out Judas, he was
yeah,
betraying
yeah,
the folk music movement and so on by going electric. It's a reminder that in some ways, to advance, you do have to betray something, someone, some value. You have to kick against it, and oftentimes you're kicking against the thing that has most influenced you,
yeah. Oh, that's
and against
interesting. Yeah,
your friends and maybe your parents, because
yeah.
you simply have to carve out that kind of freedom to act as you want. And so when artists do that, I'm just in awe. I think it's amazing, and you just hope as a critic that you can be receptive to that when it's happening. But it's not so easy, right?
Now you
We're
got your
often sort of
tastes.
blindsided. Yep,
You got your
that's right.
taste. And there's things you like and there's things you don't. And there's a lot of stuff I don't like.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
I
we all
would,
like to think that we would have recognized,
I
the
don't know,
importance of what
man.
Dylan was doing or what
Yeah,
Van Gogh was doing. Poor Vincent, right? Like he just, no one got it. And you look at it now and you think, how did they not get
I
it? It's
know.
so full of
I
life and
know.
energy and beauty, and yet they didn't. And it would probably be presumptuous to think that you or I would have. I mean, gosh, we can only hope. But
Maybe you would have
yeah,
loved it and you would have been shunned.
yeah,
That
maybe,
would have
maybe.
been the end of your career. All right. So here's my question to you. So you write this beautiful book and you work like crazy on it, but what was the most surprising thing that you discovered in writing it? What was it that maybe changed you even a little bit?
Think there was something that I discovered in reading the letters of Bert Morisot, right? It's interesting. She had a sister, they were both painters, and her sister, they were both really good painters, and they'd been accepted into the official salon several years running. So they were pretty committed. Edma was just as good as Bert Morisot, and
Oh,
some people said she was better. But just before all these events, she got married and had kids and was basically forced into giving up painting.
right.
And I think many expected Bert Morisot to follow suit, and that was probably going to be her fate as well. But then she lived through this siege where she was reduced to starvation, illness. Was really lucky to escape with her life, um, and and got through that. And in the immediate aftermath of that experience, she wrote a letter to her sister, knowing that this might have been painful to her sister, but they were really close, so they had a great understanding. And she said, all right, I'm going to commit myself to art, to making a profession of art. I'm going to take myself seriously. This is what I'm going to do. And, it sounds like a small thing. It's buried in this letter. But when I discovered it, I realized that for a woman at that time in history and having gone through what she'd gone through, and with all the expectations on her from society to get married and have kids and probably give it away, to do that and to write that down took enormous courage. And she went on to become this incredibly important, influential, and courageous painter. So that for me was a real moment, and I really wanted to emphasize that in my narrative.
Well, you did. And it's almost like she was like, she comes close to death and she had, sounds like she had a moment like, what am I doing here? What is the
Yeah,
point of this? Like I'm alive, so what am I going to do with this life? And like,
exactly.
what will I do with it instead of just what am I supposed to do with it? So
Yeah,
sometimes the worst thing in the world is the best thing for you, baby. We don't want
I
to go
love it.
through a
I love
siege,
it.
but maybe it's what you needed. And also, she did. I don't like usually go here, but she's painting women and interiors, and it had it. It's sort of like, hey, they, by making them the subject, she was saying they matter too. Look at them. Look at that moment.
Yeah.
That
These subjects
matters.
hadn't been addressed in that
Yeah.
way before in her style, and she really captured the sort of fleeting and transient nature of girlhood, of adolescence, of young womanhood, and she did it with such a poignant sort of feeling of how ephemeral life can be, because she knew she'd gone through all this. She knew how ephemeral life could be. The funny thing is as well that, I make the case, and I think a lot of people, have accepted this, from way before I wrote about it, but that she and Manet were in love, but they
Right.
couldn't marry
Right.
because he was already married, and
Right.
and yet they had this incredibly intimate relationship. And the funny thing is that she ends up marrying his brother. It was kind of the next best thing, and he
Uh,
was a good husband, and he understood what it took to be an artist, and he supported her in a way that wasn't typical of that time for sure.
well, when you sell the film rights, I will go see the movie because this sucker needs to be a movie for sure. Okay, so the book is Paris in Ruins. Listen, people, you'll educate yourself, but more than that, it's a great story and really engrossingly told. And I think people are going to like it. Paris in Ruins. Go get it. Now, I'm not quite done with you, my friend. Not quite done with you. I want you to answer one more question. I want you to think about all the writing you've done, all the way back to when you were just a 23-year-old pup out there in Australia, in the outback, in the bush, and you were writing, starting your career. And you think about all the writing you've done, and if it's taught you anything about being a person, about being human, about life, it's taught you what?
Such a great question. I would say that if you want to appreciate something, whether it's art, and maybe this applies to other things too, but let's just stick to art for now. You need to bring to it an impulse to like it, to love it.
Mm,
If you're disappointed, that's fine. you can talk about that, and that can be super interesting when you don't love something, and it's just not to your taste, or you just think it's failing in some way or another. That's super interesting and worth exploring. But if you don't bring that impulse to like it, to that first engagement with it, then you're selling the thing itself short, and I think you're selling yourself short. And so it's a maybe you can apply that to other experiences in life too. That man, I really want to go up in a balloon because balloons played a big part in this
Yeah,
story that
yeah,
I've written.
yeah.
And one day I'm going to do it, and I know that a big part of me is going to be afraid, but I'm I'm going to say, hey man, this is what I really want to do, and bring that impulse to actually engage and love it to the experience.